So I like Kubrick a lot, but I've seen many of his works, but I like The Shining the best of all. I think there are some scenes in that movie that could not, if you tried to film them better and you tried to come up with a more artistic way of presenting things. That classic scene of the two girls in the hallway when Danny is actually riding his big wheel through the hotel, in the way that he uses the sounds of him on the carpeting and then on the hard floors and then on the carpeting, and the way he just goes into that scene, in the classic scene with those two girls like looking at him down the hallway. You cannot get better than that. I mean, filmically, the astonishing beauty of those scenes and horror of those scenes just cannot be. Once you see that, you will never. That will come to your mind as the best and most frightening scene in any horror movie. It's probably, for many people, it's probably the most horrifying scene ever. You know, the two girls saying, "Come with us, Danny." You know, it's really terrifying, man. You know, because he's sitting on this big wheel, man, and he's like, whoa. You know, he's got this look like, whoa, that's frightening. Then he doesn't do what I would do, which would be like, I would be pedaling my big wheel backwards, going back just the way I came. But he doesn't do that. He just stays there staring at them. You know, and both my friend Laurita here and I, we completely agree that something about that actor, that young boy, was ultimately the best choice for that character. So you can compare The Shining television series, and then the actor in that television series, he just didn't scare me like Danny scares me in Kubrick's version. And so in a way, I mean, they're very different. The novel by Stephen King is an excellent presentation. It goes more deeply into the psychological factors of Jack Nicholson's character, and how it is that Mr. Torrance becomes the way that he becomes. He finds a cache of documents relating to the hotel's history in the novel, Stephen King's Shining. And so he begins reading these details of the hotel's history, and then so Stephen King, in these scenes, he's able to present these really weird things that happened in the past at the hotel, and these kind of odd characters, but Kubrick does his own presentation of this, and he telescopes a lot of what it is that happens in the novel. But if you want to deepen the horror that you feel, read Stephen King's Shining and watch the film. Like, do both, because you will find there's some things in Kubrick's version that they're not accurate, but they are the way he decided to present things. In the novel, the bushes, the way they're trimmed, I forget the name that I wanted to use for that. It's a certain name about, I've lost it to my consciousness right now. But the bushes in the novel are trimmed in a certain way, and they're animals. They're cut out to be animals. And so when Danny goes out and he plays in The Shining during the day, in one scene, actually the shrubs and bushes come to life and they chase him. And so it's like, really, that's pretty terrifying, but obviously that would have been very difficult to do mechanically if you tried to present that. So in the movie that you watch by Kubrick, you actually get the maze in the movie. And it's not a maze in the novel. It's these animal topiary animals, And so, but that would have been too complicated for Hollywood to present. Now today, if they were to remake The Shining, if, let's say, a remake version of it with all the effects that are possible, you could actually represent the shrubs as animals, or the topiary as animals, and you could actually produce a scene where he's being chased by them. And it would be something, Spielberg or someone, a really good filmmaker who was very good at technical design, could do something like that. And maybe even they could do something like that, and they could put that back in, they could put that into The Shining and make an alternative version of it, so that you could actually have what Stephen King, because many things Stephen King didn't like that. He didn't like the fact that his imagination had produced the idea of these animals that were, shrubs and trees that could chase Danny, and then Kubrick decided to just, go with this maze idea. But I think the maze was very effective in the movie because it's central to showing you how intuitive and intelligent Danny is, because he outsmarts his father, Mr. Torrance, who's trying to kill him. When he backs up in the snow, you can see the scene where he's backstepping, and he actually fools his dad into thinking that he went in one direction, but he goes into another in the maze. And so that is one of the most excellent scenes. But think of how he must have felt. This is really weird. He had to plot the death of his dad to save his own life. But he actually, when he steps back in the snow, he's doing it to save his life. But then it must have occurred to him after that because he did that, his dad's going to freeze to death. So then you get that scene, of Nicholson frozen the next morning, man, just right out in the sky, man, and you're in front of the hotel, and it's one of the most bizarre scenes that you ever look at in film. But it's a pretty excellent scene, though, in there, where he's actually going through the maze, and he's terrified, and you're terrified, too. You're terrified for him, and you're terrified for his dad. That's, I think, one of the paradoxical things about watching The Shining is that you have an enormous amount of compassion for Mr. Torrance. That he is experiencing these things, but you also have a certain amount of dislike and even in a way hatred of him when he swings the bat at his wife. See, that at that point you're whoa, now that goes too far. It's a horror movie, so something bad has to happen, but it makes you hate him when he does that. But it also makes you compassionate in certain scenes. I think there's a better job of that done in Stephen King's novel. It's a more humanizing presentation, whereas the Jack Nicholson character in Kubrick ends up being a little less sympathetic because of how mean he becomes. But you do have the one scene where he's in a state of catatonic depression, and he's just sitting in the bed. And I think that's the most compassionate scene that you have for him. Because he is experiencing the roots of this hotel, and he is frozen in a state of suspended animation and of terror. He's terrified. But he can come to see him, Jack Nicholson can come to see him not sympathetic at many times throughout The Shining, especially when he decides to kill his family. But on the other hand, like I say, he does love his child and he does love his wife. So he's human, he's presented in a human way, and so it's a challenge to people to kind of say what did that. And in the book, as you get this cache of documents where Jack Nicholson is reading, and the boiler is like a really important part of that boiler room, is where he finds the documents, and he starts going through the documents of the hotel, and he's always rubbing his lip. He always wants to drink alcohol, see, and he can't drink alcohol because he quit, and so he's always like rubbing his lips till they're dry because he wants a drink. And he just reads on and on about these weird scenes, and that hotel is like on an Indian burial ground. And so there's this kind of reasoning that I'm applying in my Beloit Folk and Blues novel of how a place influences what we are and what we feel and how we think, but that we're free too. See, that it's an interaction with ourselves and the world that takes place in the world was portrayed so well in that movie, and maybe even for the same reasons Beloit College has this kind of like ability to throw up oppositions, like the one between Maria and Linda back in the 80s when I dated Maria. And maybe even some people who work at the college and so on have experienced themselves these kind of sort of polarities of feeling or oppositions of feeling, and so they too are experiencing something like, if there were Indians buried on the campus of Beloit College, then that's a kind of a magnetization of our very minds that interacts with our minds. It's not like a possession of, it's not going to come to possess anybody, but because you're free. But it's something, it is a factor in influencing, just like in the movie, it was Jack Nicholson's freedom that caused him to take the step of going after his family like that. He had to have freedom, I think, for that movie to make sense to me and that novel to make sense to me. But on the other hand, he was being heavily influenced by factors that were beyond his control. Like, he didn't know that the hotel had that kind of grip or hold upon him, just like at 2012, as we dance there, and people kind of become possessed when they dance, because they're in the grip of the music, they're in the grip of whatever forces are affecting them, they're in the force field of wherever we are, as humans, wherever we are, when we're talking to other human beings, we're in the force field of their minds and their bodies. And so I'm trying to say that this is not something that should scare people. It's something that should cause them to be more reflective about how they're feeling when they're experiencing a certain thing, or why they're feeling a certain way when they're experiencing something. And not to like kind of put out this like it's this hex or this curse and it can't be avoided, because the precise idea of the novel is to show how the debutante and Madison, how they overcome something like the force field that took Jack Nicholson in The Shining and turned his freedom into deterministic unfreedom. And so I'm showing how they did the opposite, how they resist these forces of opposition and how they overcome that opposition and how they come to possess themselves fully and their freedom fully, precisely by noticing how they feel and how they're interacting with the world.